Hi, everyone, and welcome to the start of WDI USA's monthly exploration of what the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights means for women and girls in real life. My name is Kara Dansky, and I'm the president of the US chapter of Women's Declaration International. Each month starting today, we will explore an article of the Declaration. We will host a panel of women who will speak about what that particular article means for her in her actual life. We will explore why the Declaration is so important for the lives of women and girls. Each panel discussion will be followed by a question and answer session. This live webinar is exclusively for women. If you are not a woman, we encourage you to watch it later on YouTube. Tonight, we will be discussing Article 1 of the Declaration on reaffirming that the rights of women are based upon the category of sex. The Declaration is clear. States should maintain the centrality of the category of sex and not gender identity in relation to women's and girls' rights to be free from discrimination. States should ensure that the words woman, girl, and the terms traditionally used to refer to women's body parts and bodily functions on the basis of sex continue to be those used in constitutional acts, legislation, in the provision of services, and in policy documents when referring to persons of the female sex. The meaning of the word woman shall not be changed to include men. Nonetheless, the US has been redefining sex to include gender identity throughout US law with astonishing speed. This will have disastrous consequences for women and girls. Tonight, we have 5 great speakers. Sheila Jeffries and Joe Brew from WDI UK will talk about the urgency of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Lierre Keith, founder of Wolf, will discuss the agony of women's sex-based oppression. Amy Ichikawa from Woman to Woman will discuss the horrors of housing men in women's prisons. Last, Donna Hughes from the University of Rhode Island will discuss the fantasy of gender identity. I am tonight's facilitator. I will be introducing each of the speakers and facilitating the question and answer session to follow. If you would like to ask a question, please place your question in the Q&A box rather than using chat. We'll start with Sheila Jeffries and Joe Brew and then pause for questions there. If you have a question for Sheila or Joe, please put it in the Q&A box during their presentations and we will take them after their talks. Then they will probably leave the webinar because it is quite late in the UK where they both are. We'll take all other questions at the end of the webinar. With that, let's get started. Sheila Jeffries is a radical feminist writer and activist on issues such as violence against women, pornography, and lesbian feminism. She became a feminist in the UK in 1973 and moved to Australia in 1991 to teach at the University of Melbourne. She moved back to the UK in 2015. She is the author of 11 books on the history and politics of sexuality. Her new book, Penile Imperialism, The Male Sex Right and Women's Subordination, will be published in October. She is a director of Women's Declaration International. Welcome, Sheila.
Thanks, Cara. I'm delighted to be here with you all. And what I'm going to do today, because I'm one of the authors of the Declaration, is talk to you about why we felt in 2019 that it was needed. Something extraordinary happened in the last 2 decades. A male sexual fetish was transformed into a human right. Up until the 1990s, men's cross-dressing behavior, their imitation of what they saw as women's clothing and behavior, was known in sexology, the science of sex, as a form of sexual fetishism. It was understood as a sexual perversion and called transvestism. But in the 2000s, men have been increasingly recognized as having a human right to express their gender identity in public and to be able to enter all women's spaces and masquerade as women in women's sports, in parliaments, and so on. So far, this has not happened with men's other sexual perversions, such as nappy fetishism. Not yet, anyway. I prefer to call gender identity sex stereotype identity, because that is what it consists of. For transvestites, who are the great majority of men who cross-dress, womanhood consists of sex stereotypes such as high-heeled shoes and frilly underwear. All of this goes against the definition of what a woman is and what women's rights are that were established in the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1979. In that convention, women's rights are based on sex, and there's no mention of gender. The language of gender had, thankfully, not been adopted by anyone in the field of human rights at that time. Moreover, the convention says that states should take steps to eliminate sex stereotypes, not protect them. Since that time, there's been a huge campaigning effort by men who are transvestites to transform the understanding of their behavior in the science of sexology and in society in general. They sanitize their behavior by saying that instead of being motivated by masochism, they actually had an essence of gender inside themselves that made them women. Until the last decade, very few feminists had raised the alarm at the assertion by these men that they should be considered to actually be women. That was because the women's liberation movement had been largely defeated and disappeared. And it was because lesbian and gay rights had been mainstreamed and the transvestites hitched themselves to the wagon of gay rights. Progressive persons, after the defeat of feminism, accepted the so-called rights of men to pretend to be women as the new cause to be promoted. I wrote about the insult of men pretending to be women in various books from 1990s onwards. By the early 2000s, I was becoming aware of the huge harms that the transvestite ideology was causing to lesbians, to children, to feminism, to women's rights and opportunities. I needed to write something that pulled all this together. So my book, Gender Hurts, from 2014, examines all these harms. I wrote it as a wake-up call for feminists, and it came at the right time because a new wave of feminism was just being born. But I did not realize back in 2014 just how far these men's conceits could actually take them. By 2019, it was clear that there was a state of emergency. It had become almost impossible for women to express their disagreement with the idea that men can become women. Women who were critical were getting visits from the police and even being arrested for stating biological facts. Local councils, the Girl Guides, the health service, schools were all promoting this nonsense with very harmful effects on women and children. Women were losing rights to their spaces, their opportunities and prizes to women's sports. It was also clear that the pernicious ideology was being applied in ways which threatened women's rights throughout the international human rights community. Increasingly, the word woman was being expunged and replaced by the word gender. Sex stereotypes were taking the place of women. We had to say again and loud and clear that women's human rights are based on sex. The politics of men's sexual fetish, now called gender identity, were leading to the erasure of women in the law and in policy. So we created the Declaration, a document that could be used to enable us as women to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And as always, it's so wonderful to hear from you. And thank you for all your amazing work on this. Now we will hear from Jo Brew. Jo is co-coordinator of Women's Declaration International. She's a radical feminist, activist, and writer. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint to introduce the Women's Declaration. So I'm the coordinator of Women's Declaration International, which is a not-for-profit feminist organisation promoting women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. The declaration that Sheila Jeffries is a co-author of and has explained calls on policymakers in international institutions, states and organisations at all levels to resist moves to redefine the word woman from meaning adult human female to anyone who says they have a gender identity. Women's rights gained globally over recent decades are under threat. So the declaration that we promote in Women's Declaration International is a 6,600 word statement reaffirming our support for women's rights based on sex. It's supported by 31,094 individuals and is still open, so we get more signatories every day from 159 countries, and the UN recognises 193 states, so it's nearly all the countries or states in the world. There are 439 organisations supporting the declaration. We have over 100 volunteer activists and 53 country contacts. Since our launch in New York in March 2019, we have been holding meetings and running webinars defending women's sex-based rights. Based around this document, the declaration, we've heard from hundreds of women about their situation and their countries. Now, this slide shows some of the organisations of the nearly 450 who support and have signed up to the declaration. So there are women all over the world, and women's organisations, and in fact, all sorts of organisations that have seen the threat posed by gender identity ideology. We have weekly feminist question time. We have a regular audience of over 200 women, and our videos have had nearly 500,000 views. We run webinars in French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and English, and we're helping to build an independent international women's movement committed to universal women's rights, our sex-based rights. Until recently, the UN, the United Nations Women's Units, UN Women, and the Commission on the Status of Women were really promoting women's rights and progress for women. But this is now fundamentally threatened by very well-funded initiatives, convincing policymakers to redefine the definition of women, and to say that women internationally either don't mind or see the redefinition as a progressive step. So our declaration and our international sisterhood is a clear statement that this just is not the case, and we lobby the United Nations and governments to make our voices heard. So our international role of WDI, this shows some of the reach of our YouTube channel. So our most watched video is a report from Mother of Swimmer USA, who had 34,000 views. And you could see a range of different things. And then also recently on March the 2nd, we had a webinar that was watched. You can see that it's being watched internationally. There's lots more information on the site, but I won't show it to you. So our role and the sort of work that I'm involved in doing is trying to build an international network, to make a credible and strong alternative to the voices of UN Women and NGOs, non-governmental organisations such as Oxfam or Human Rights Campaign and ILGA, the International Lesbian and Gay Association, who are promoting gender identity ideology internationally. So we're really the biggest voice countering that narrative internationally, and trying to link up with women all over the world to let their voices be heard. Although it's a difficult job, one great opportunity we have these internet video conferencing like Zoom and YouTube. That's something that's really unique, that's just happened in the last 5 years, and is a real possibility for women internationally, for us to network and hopefully move towards creating a new alternative, sort of go forward from here. Although this is a threat to our rights, I see that we can now work together internationally to create a sort of vision of the sort of world that we want as radical feminists, and hopefully make this into an opportunity. So I'm quite positive, thinking that there are things that we can do that can be positive.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask Sheila or Joe before they jump off and go get some rest? I am not seeing any questions in the Q&A. Okay. Emily says, much gratitude for all you are doing for us. My question is, are there women of color?
Well, I'll answer that. There are, yeah, on our webinars, we have many women of color. And we've got, if you look on our YouTube channel, you'll see that we've had Heli Saint Luce, who's a sort of English woman, but of Afro-Caribbean origin. And we've Suzanne Forbes-Vierling spoke recently. We also have regular interventions or sort of speeches from women from all over the world. Vaishnavi Sundar, the filmmaker, she was on our channel presenting about the situation of women in India last week. So I would say very much so. Yeah, definitely. It's a very truly international initiative.
Perfect. I think that was the only question. Joe and Sheila, you're welcome. You're more than welcome to stay for as long as you'd like, but we understand if you have to go. Thank you both so much for being here.
Have a nice webinar. I'm going to watch it later, tomorrow morning or something.
Great.
Okay. Bye.
So next we'll hear from Lierre Keith. Lierre has been a radical feminist for 40 years. She's the author of 7 books, including The Vegetarian Myth, Food, Justice, and Sustainability, which has been called the most important ecological book of this generation. She is co-author with Derrick Jensen and Max Wilbert of Bright Green Lies, how the environmental movement lost its way and what we can do about it. She lives in Northern California with giant trees and giant dogs. She's also been arrested 6 times for acts of political resistance. Welcome, Lierre.
Hey, thanks, Kara. And thanks everybody for coming here today. So in the beginning, this came out in 1970. What Robin Morgan was saying with that title is that women are a class. We are not a random collection of individuals. We are a political group. We share a common condition, and that condition is oppression. But the solution is embedded in the problem. If we share a common condition, we can also make common cause. That group solidarity can give us the power to dislodge patriarchy. All of that in 3 words. It was a very radical title. This current wave of feminism came naturally out of the work that women were doing in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Women took the tools of political analysis learned on the left and applied them to our own lives. Teach slaves to read, eventually they revolt. Eventually, they also write their own political theory. Women got together in small groups and began comparing the details of their lives. The truth is that men are brutalizing women on a mass scale, that they have done so across cultures and across millennia, that institutions from the church to the courts to the media collude, that women have very little recourse. Putting women at the center of the political analysis creates a chasm between feminism and the left. The ways that men use power over women is very different than the ways they do that to each other. The central elements of subordination, like hierarchy, objectification, violence, those are the same, but they happen to women in the realm called private. They're done by men who claim to love us, and they're done through actions that men experience as sex. And that's the exact moment that we lose the lefty men. Freedom for them is libertine sadism, the right to break every boundary women have, all for the orgasms they get from it. Done to anyone else, these acts would be recognized as both political oppression and torture. Done to women, it's sexy fun. This is a quote from Andrea Dworkin. In the subordination of women, inequality itself is sexualized, made into the experience of sexual pleasure, essential to sexual desire. This is the hardest part of what we have to face as feminists. As Germaine Greer wrote, women have very little idea of how much men hate them. Especially, women have very little idea how much men enjoy hating us. The sadist only gets worse. He never bottoms out. And his endpoint is necrophilia. A personality with an endless drive to prove itself against another, any other, creates a violation imperative. Or as Derek Jensen describes with spare eloquence, for men in patriarchy, everything is violable and everything must be violated. Men become real men by breaking boundaries. But the sadist is never satiated. There's always another wild being or self-willed creature who must be broken and brought to heel. Now, it would be one thing, horrible in its own right, if men were doing these things to us to extract labor and other resources. But they're doing it because, in the end, they enjoy it. Because it gives them a hard-on. I'm sorry to be so crude, but that is the harsh truth. Male supremacy doesn't just naturalize oppression. All systems of domination claim to be cosmic, fixed, eternal, formed by God or evolution or karma, as above, so below, so that those below don't get ideas above their station. But male supremacy goes one better. It sexualizes acts of oppression. It eroticizes domination and subordination, inscribing synapses of sadism into the brain. Anything tied to sexual response will feel not just natural, but primal. Arousal lights up the limbic system, a part of the brain so ancient it's found in all vertebrates. It also shuts down parts of the prefrontal cortex, which is what heroin does. A surge of dopamine and endorphins produce euphoria. Every area of the brain involved in sex is activated maximally. There is no stronger endogenous stimuli. That's all been hijacked by patriarchy, and very specifically by the porn industry. The scale of the takeover is nearly inconceivable. Pornography sites get more traffic than Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and LinkedIn combined. Close to 1/3 of all downloads in the US are from a porn site. In 2019, uploads to Pornhub came to 12,500 gigabytes per minute. That's enough content to fill the memory of every single cell phone on the planet, every minute. Across the culture, this vicious industry is rewriting our collective sexual script by fusing sex with hatred and humiliation. Women are being strangled to unconsciousness is now a common feature on popular porn sites. And then these men, saturated in sexual sadism, interact with women in real life. Over 1/3 of women between 18 and 39 have experienced unwanted slapping, choking, gagging, or spitting during, quote, consensual sex. Activist Fiona McKenzie explains, quote, many of these women live with quite extreme trauma. They can't wear clothes that's close to their neck or jewelry. They just don't date men anymore because it's too scary, and they've been assaulted too many times. There's a surge in the so-called rough sex defense, which has resulted in sexual murderers getting off on manslaughter convictions. To put it bluntly, men are strangling women to death for sexual pleasure and getting away with it. The generative impulse of our species, biologically rich with exquisite nerves and alchemical joy, has been transmuted into necrophilia. If hatred feels like sex and is practiced as sex, then the sluts are getting what they deserve. This is both the core of patriarchy and its brilliance. The brilliance of feminism is that we figured that out. If one woman told the truth about her life, wrote poet Muriel Rukeyser, the world would split open. We did, by the hundreds and then the thousands. And then we started counting. The numbers are a trauma all their own. If you were born female, you were born on a battlefield. You will be punished for even saying that out loud. But the grim truth is, you're going to be punished no matter what for the sin of being female. Battering is the most commonly committed violent crime in the United States. That's a man beating up a woman. A man does that every 9 seconds. 1/3 of battering starts when a woman is pregnant, and male violence, a man's willful fist or foot, is the #1 cause of birth defects. That's more hatred than I can comprehend. So right now that battlefield is such a slaughter, we can't even collect our wounded. 80,000 American children are sexually abused every year, and 80% of the time, quote, a parent is the perpetrator. You know it's not their mothers. One by one, men do this to the most vulnerable. Children are so easy to control and even easier to hurt. The small bones break, the fragile tissues tear, the fledgling self splinters from its only body. 80,000 times the world should stop spinning, and it doesn't, and I don't know why. Globally, all the above happens and more. There are 60 million child brides, 200 million survivors of female genital mutilation, and 126 million girls aborted for being female. This is why we call it a war. If those numbers aren't just background noise, the inevitable, unremarkable actions of everyday men taking what is theirs, but actual crimes done to human beings. If women are political subjects with inalienable rights, then there is a word for harm at this scale. War fits, but men scoff when we say it. Fine, but I would like to know what else to call it. There are entire villages in India where all the women, all of them, only have one kidney because their husbands have sold the other one, sold their kidney. And there are people who want to argue that gender is some kind of sexy, fun performance or an identity we all get to choose. Entire villages, all the women, one kidney. This is not a performance, and it is not an identity. It's an atrocious human rights violation against an entire class of people, people called women. And that is the meaning of gender, and precisely why it needs to be abolished. Now, to win justice, we have to take power away from men and dismantle their institutions. That means direct confrontations with power. It means having a decisive impact on the institutions that are responsible for our subordination, especially the sexualization of our oppression. The sex industry is selling women online as sluts and pornography, selling women on the streets as disposable objects, selling women on stripper poles as body parts that deserve contempt, and all women have to live in a world where men have a right to buy, use, and even murder us. Brick by brick, we have to bring that down. So we're going to have to match their contempt with our courage. We're going to have to match their brute power with our fierce and fragile dreams. We're going to have to match that endless sadism with a determination that will not bend and will not break and will not stop, because this is a war. And I know I am not the only person here today who intends to win it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lier. I just want to pause and say, you know, part of the reason I asked Lier to talk on that topic is because I really do want us to understand just how bad and just how dire the situation is for women and girls all over the world. And this is in part why the Declaration is so important. We cannot deny the reality of sex-based oppression, and Article 1 makes that perfectly clear. So we'll move on to hearing from Amy Ichikawa. Amy is a formerly incarcerated advocate for women inside. She's the founder and executive director of Woman to Woman, which is a grassroots nonprofit that provides peer support, connections to dignified reentry service, parole suitability preparedness, and advocating when policy puts incarcerated women in danger. She aims to support incarcerated women by giving them their voices back, educating them on what rights they have, and showing them how to use them. Amy is here tonight to talk about the lives of women on the inside. She is also involved in Wolf's pending litigation concerning California's SB 132 law, but because that litigation is pending, we're asking that women not ask her questions specifically about that lawsuit. We really want to hear from Amy about working with the women inside. So thanks so much for being here, Amy.
Thank you. Let me just start by saying I'm so excited, and this is such an honor to be included in this panel. I still can't believe it's happening. So just to start, just to kind of piggyback on what Lier said, this is definitely a war. This isn't a practice or a drill. Like, we're in the middle of the fight of our lives because that's what's at stake. So I'd like to start by saying a little bit about bodily autonomy and how you completely lose it when you become state property. When you enter into the carceral system and you're processed into the prison, you no longer have control over a single cell in your body. You don't have control over your environment, over what they're going to do to you. You have absolutely no say in anything. Your voice is taken. What little rights you thought you did have, which most women who are incarcerated are unaware of, those are gone. And that's when the Stockholm Syndrome starts. Women are conditioned to be in fear of asking for help and complaining about things that hurt, anything. The conditioning is very heavy in there. It's very hard to explain. Your entire frame of mind changes, and it's a scared survival mode that you enter into once you get there. And it's so scary that I'm afraid to tell my peers that there's actually 287 pending transfers from the men's prison to the women's facilities, and 33.8% of those transfers are registered sex offenders. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, but you know, with the support of everybody here and with the continued support and encouragement from Wolf and the other organizations that have, you know, pulled us out of the dirt, we're going to make some leeway. We're going to get some human rights reinstated to the women's prisons. I do have a couple of pieces I'd like to share. One is from a friend of mine who's a mom. She's got some pretty awesome kids, and she's serving life in CCWF, which is the largest women's prison in the world. And she said, I don't agree with the men coming here at all. I don't agree with them being treated differently than us women. They have more privileges, and staff is so afraid to offend them, they get away with anything. If they want to come here to be treated like women, that's fine. But I've seen so much manipulation from all of them. The manipulation opens the door for misconduct. The original bill was designed to protect some class of people that have been harmed and abused for a really long time. This bill has warped into something that now reflects a complete disregard for our safety and security. As women and inmates, our voices have been silenced, and we've been told by society and by the system that we do not matter. This cemented that we do not matter. A bill came out to say that the lives of trans people matter more than the lives of women. We're once again forgotten, neglected, and disregarded because we do not matter. That's from One Yard. And this is a piece from another friend of mine. We were actually pretty good friends during my term. Her name's Amy too, and she started off by saying thank you for this opportunity. Her name is Amy, and she's a juvenile offender who's currently serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. She was 16 at the time of her offense. Sorry, let me go back into the right tense. I'm now 41 years old. I've been incarcerated for many years and faced with many policy and protocol changes throughout the years. We're once again faced with the abusive conditions in which CDCR has a legacy. It's a place where protocols are swept under the rug, and CDCR's performances are clearly inhumane and ineffective, evidenced by the increase in incident reports. However, I was born and still reside in the United States of America, which proudly talks about one's constitutional rights. Therefore, how is it that all of a sudden, many of my rights are so callously stripped away by a system so crooked that they tweak their rules so as not to upset society and justify their wrongdoings? CDCR avoids disclosure, acceptance, accountability, and responsibility of their dirty deeds to prevent public scrutiny. It's also a brazen and innovative way of bypassing the court system. Can you imagine the outcry if the truth were revealed? Upon arrival, many of the transfers were forced to live among one another after being told and reassured that it would be discretionary. I personally witnessed a trans rip off his attire and gangbang to my entire room that hit with his frame and strength towering over all of us. PREA has been widely utilized as a form of manipulation. And PREA, let me give you some background. PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, so that's federal law. PREA has been widely utilized as a form of manipulation in over a dozen cases pertaining to the transfers. Behind closed doors, they dominate. In reality, everything changes behind the walls. Their medication is issued via pill form. and they're called KOPs, so you can keep it on your person. This allows them to take it at will. Many do not, as it causes impotency, and that is a problem when attempting to fornicate, but they will take it upon testing to show that their levels are up. However, the women transitioning are forced to go to the med line and receive an injection by the nurse. That's called a hot med. So if you don't go and get that hot med, you get a write-up. So you see how this is very imbalanced. There are posters in every clinic and medical setting listing the perks upon pregnancy. More than 80% of women have suffered some form of abuse in here, whether it be emotional, physical, sexual, upon the hands of men. Our governor is more concerned about placating minority groups by the passing of this bill under the cover and secrecy of COVID than the safety and security of the women he's responsible for protecting, despite the choices that led us here. Many women are subjected to this trauma and live countless days and nights in fear. It's unnerving that the opportunity for rehabilitation is jeopardized and challenged by a bill set forth by the government, the very same entity that stands firm on their claim for rehabilitation and education. Every last person has failed to put our needs first and put politics first. In doing so, you've silenced women, some of which just found their voice and their footing, then offered no services to remedy this. I'm not against any person having a choice to be who they want to be. I support many people that have chosen to transition. I'm only asking that we amend this and it only be allowed for post-op to at least alleviate the initial problem at hand. The trauma suffered at the hands of all women has been severely overlooked. Your tax-paying dollars are being wasted on repressing many women, not rehabilitating and rebuilding lives. Talk to us, listen to us, hear us. Together we can make a difference. Support restoring lives and the need for change now. Thank you for your time. So those are both the letters that I picked out of quite a few that I had on hand, but I think they both gave a pretty good idea of how disturbing it is and how not only have you lost your physical rights, but you're losing your mental rights too. Your own sense of reality, your reality is being challenged. If you see one thing and experience one thing, they are correcting that and telling you that's not how you're experiencing it. That's a whole different form of incarceration. It's one thing to put us behind bars, but when you extend those bars even into the mind, it's ludicrous. It's something that nobody should ever have to be subjected to. And the only reason why they are subjected to it, again, is because they're women. It's just a whole different kind of oppression. And I'm just going to continue to do everything I can to alleviate some of that misery that kind of existence is not really existing. So thank you.
Amy, thanks so much. And in case you're not seeing, you're getting a lot of thanks and praise in the chat. And I also just want to thank you so much for your work and for bringing the voices of these women to us tonight. And as I said, this recording will go on YouTube, and we'll hope that those women can be heard by as many people as possible. So thank you so much. We will hear from Donna. Donna Hughes is a professor and holds the Eleanor M. and Oscar M. Carlson Endowed Chair in Women's Studies at the University of Rhode Island. She's been a radical feminist since the early 1980s. Most of her work has focused on sexual exploitation and violence, particularly sex trafficking, prostitution, and pornography. Donna, thanks so much for being with us here tonight.
Sure, really happy to be here. And Amy, thank you so much for what you said. There are so many of us that, we may have been in the feminist movement for years and we know so little about what you're talking about. So it is absolutely essential, and I'm so glad you were here to share that with us. Okay, I'm here to talk about a piece that I wrote a little over a year ago that's called Fantasy Worlds on the Political Right and Left, QAnon and trans-sex beliefs. Like a lot of people, I was living in lockdown with COVID and getting quite bored. But one of the things is that I'm an avid reader and sort of compulsive news reader. And of course, I just read lots of stuff. And I saw the emergence of the QAnon movement that people were believing in. And then I've also have been reading for years and familiar with scholars' work like Sheila Jeffries on gender, sex and gender issues. So one of the things that I decided to do was to write something comparing QAnon on the right and what I call trans sex on the left. And we know that there are a large number of people, probably millions of people, that believe in the QAnon ideas. And I believe that they are fantasies and they are lies and people are being manipulated by them. It's a body of disinformation based on the idea that there's an international cabal of Satan worshiping, sex trafficking pedophiles that are controlling the whole world. And one of the things that happened with these ideas is that they became politicized. So they changed to attacking liberals and Democrats with these. They said that they were the ones that were the pedophiles. And it became further weaponized when they said that Donald Trump was who, and the Make America Great movement, were going to save children from the pedophiles. And the QAnon group became further radicalized then with the Stop the Steal movement, in which there were attacks on the US Congress, and they were attempting to stop the democratic process of counting the electoral college votes for president, for president. These are really, so we came right to the precipice of a coup here in the United States. And that was all based on on fantasy beliefs that became politically radicalized and weaponized. So it's, turned in what seemed to be just silly ideas became very serious. That's on the political right. Then I turned and looked at the political left. And what I saw there was the trans sex fantasy. The idea that you could change sex if you wanted. And that's what was being talked about then. One of the things I realized is that this movement is moving so fast that things that were being talked about and said 14 months ago, as I was rereading this, are no longer discussed anymore. They've already moved on to something else. But I'm going to describe what it is that I wrote. And it was that the idea, the trans sex fantasy was the idea that a person could change sex. And these ideas were being sold to teens online, causing a lot of harm. And of course, it really brought me to the idea of saying, well, what's a woman then? And we know that now that this is a great deal of debate about what is a woman. And we know that there have been lies told about women for centuries. And that's one of the reasons we have the women's movement. And that is to fight back against those lies and to retain our rights. One of the things that I mentioned in this article is sort of the genesis of gender. And that is, it was an idea from the second wave of the women's movement. And that is that the goal was to separate gender from sex. And that is that you could have feminine or masculine characteristics that didn't necessarily match perfectly with your sex. And it was acceptable. We learned that there was such a thing as gender that was not mapped tightly to sex. And that was actually something that's really beneficial to women to learn that. Okay. Let's see. I then went on to talk about the challenges that the trans sex movement was making to women. Women were under attack. You could no longer claim the biological category of women. And women's sex was really being smashed. That we were expected to give up privacy in places such as restrooms, locker rooms, prison cells, men and boys calling themselves. Women could compete in girls and women's sports. And, you know, when I thought about this, I thought, you know, when I was growing up, if someone was taking unfair advantage of somebody else, we called it cheating. And that's what I think it is. So I said that this dystopian trans-sex gender identity world claims that female mammalian characteristics should be redefined and disappeared from the female body, and that the feelings of men were more important than the biological sex of women. Okay. Also involved in this movement is our pharmaceutical industry that is making and distributing hormones, sex hormones to give to particularly teens so that they can they can acquire the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex. So they stand to make a tremendous amount of money from this. And of course, then the medical industry is very involved in this with surgeries for either hysterectomies or mastectomies to remove a girl's breasts. Okay, and just so I'm thinking about all of this, and as serious as I said that the consequences of the QAnon movement is, we then see the same kind of really serious consequences of the trans-sex movement. And the sort of, to me, the icing on the cake was when, within hours after President Biden being sworn into office, he signed the executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of sex identity or sexual orientation. And what that means is that all offices are now to interpret existing law that prevents discrimination on the basis of sex to also include discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So sex no longer matters, and once again, how a man feels or identifies is more important than his actual identity. So we have the fantasy. The President of the United States is endorsing this kind of a fantasy.
Donna, excuse me, I'm just going to ask you to wrap up so we have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So that's really the basic premise of this that I wrote. And what happened then, of course, is another story, and that is I did not, I published this as in a little feminist website called 4W. I did not distribute it to my colleagues. I did not share it with my colleagues. And I really didn't think too much about it because I've been writing about prostitution and pornography for years, and I don't share that with them either because I know they disagree. So I was a little startled when my piece became known, and it really launched a student movement against me, which the faculty joined in. And that is that they attempted students called for me to be fired, and the faculty, my colleagues, wrote a letter denouncing me and released it to the public. I think I'll stop there and say that I was rather shocked at how rapid this response was and how vicious they became so quickly.
Thanks so much, Donna. I just want to say I really loved that piece, and I think that referring to gender identity as a fantasy and as a dangerous fantasy is extremely important. And I'm very grateful to you for bringing that and publishing that article. And, you know, something else that Donna is raising here is the reality that women are being told that we're not allowed to talk about our rights, right? She was punished for that. She was disciplined by her university. And we know that that is not even a little bit unusual. We'll be having a webinar later focusing on women's right to speech and assembly. And we'll be going into much more detail about that because those appear in later articles of the Declaration. But I guess my point is that the stakes could not be higher. The stakes for women and girls fighting for our rights could not be higher. And so thank you all for joining us. And we, as Lierre said, there are many of us who fully intend to win this battle. So far we have 2 questions. The first one's for Lierre. And this questioner quotes Dworkin as talking about how to right-wing men, we're private property, and to left-wing men, we're public property. And her question to you is, how will American women bridge the political divides between right and left to push back against male violence and oppression of women?
Right. Well, I mean, it's not that unusual that, for the last 100 years since women have been able to vote, that they have worked across the aisle on all kinds of issues, because it's what men do all the time. It's how you get things done in a democracy. So I don't actually think it's that big of a deal. I just think we have to do it. It does mean talking to people you don't agree with about a whole bunch of stuff, but that's what politics is, and if you're not cut out for it, that's fine. You can just work with women that you agree with, but somebody's going to have to get out there and actually, do the civic engagement thing. And yeah, work with women where there's a gap. But I also know that, having even done some of that, we convert them to radical feminism pretty quickly. We shouldn't be worried, like our analysis actually does describe the world as women have to live in it. And it can take a few years, but eventually, you'll have these conversations and these women say things like, 3 years ago, I thought patriarchy was a joke. I sneered at women who said things about male power. And now I can't even imagine thinking that anymore. It's so obvious that this is true. So I think that our analysis really holds, and that right-wing women also experience rape and battering and survive things like prostitution and hate pornography. So abortion is always going to be a sticking point. I get that. But sometimes they come along on that one too. So, that no matter where a woman falls on the political spectrum, that the percentage of women who have abortions is exactly the same. It doesn't matter whether they say they're pro-choice or anti-choice. It's the same percentage of women. So when they need one, they get one. And when their daughters need one, they help them get them too. So all they need is a better analysis, honestly, and they'll come to our side. So yeah, it has to be done. And it's worthwhile doing, because we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it just as radical feminists. There just simply aren't enough of us, and we don't have any political power, and we don't have any money. So just pragmatically, if we want to make progress, we're going to have to talk to everybody who wants to talk to us. And that is democracy. There's nothing wrong with that. This is the First Amendment. You have a right to talk, and you have a right to gather, to assemble. Literally, the First Amendment says this is important. If we can't do this, we're not going to have a country. So
one of the things I'd like to add, Lierre, and that is I know another radical feminist who always told me, she said, you should always be kind to every woman, because even if she doesn't agree with you, remember, she's only one decision away from joining you.
So there's one question left, and that's good, because that's probably all we have time for, and it's for Amy, which is great, and it's a great way to end our discussion. But I also just want to very quickly say, one of my favorite things that I've ever heard Lierre say was at an event that took place in a public library in Washington, D.C., and it's on this topic. And the question was posed by Madeleine Kearns, a Scottish reporter at the National Review. And Madeleine's question was, if the left can't fix this, can the right fix this? And several of us had answers, but the absolute hands down best answer to that question was Lierre's. And Lierre said, it's not going to be the left, it's not going to be the right, it's going to be women working together. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Amy, to you. What are the most, I think this is a great way to end. So thank you. This is Julie's. Amy, what are the most effective uses of our time to fight against the placement of men in women's prisons? And what can women do to support woman to woman?
Thank you. And thank you, Julie. Right now, I think we actually had this conversation not too long ago. I think it's really important to educate my friends inside. They have no idea. I didn't know what feminism was. I had no idea, only what I had heard from very close-minded grown-ups as a kid. I had no idea how oppressed, how we really don't have any rights at all. And I read a lot, so you would think that I would have known a little bit of this, but they need to be educated. We need to be educated. If I could get some assistance in developing some sort of curriculum that we could get state approval for to be part of a self-help program that they could actually get good time credit for, I think it would be freaking phenomenal, because it is, you know, well, they're not going to call it a sex-based right. Well, we'll twist it into a gender-based right. But, you know, and there's going to be some parameters we're going to have to fit into, but I think we could really start some revolutions inside by providing some education, teaching them or explaining what rights we do have, how to use them, how standing up for yourself and saying no, stop, don't is not a bad thing. Reprogramming and you know, teaching everybody in there how to not take advantage, but to utilize the rights that we do have while we do still have them. Yes, one woman sharing with not, yes, it's definitely going to be an each one teach one kind of situation. But it's going to be important and vital to get it approved by the state in order to get it in mass. Right now, I'm just sending in little postcards, little pieces of information for them to share between each other. But if we could actually get something that's organized and state approved, I think it would be impactful on a lot of different levels. It would set a precedence among precedences in the whole system, because it would show legislation, it would show staff, it would show the Department of Corrections that these women do matter and that we do care about them, and that you're not going to just erase them. Because what's going to happen is, as soon as we stop yelling and making noise about this, then the science project is done and they know what the timeline is, and then they start on us on this side. So
Amy, let me jump in, because we have to end, but there's another question for you, which I think is also a good one, which is it possible for women to learn self-defense on the inside? And if you could answer that, and then maybe we can wrap up with your sharing information about how women can contact you if they want to help you.
I am not familiar with any self-defense programs being approved, but I will find out. Anybody can contact me through the website, or and the email address is there. Even my phone number's on it. But the way you could immediately help woman to woman is stamps. We always need stamps. I always need lots of stamps. Stamps never go out of style with us. So.
So to be clear, what that means, women inside need stamps in order to send mail to their family members, and Amy gets those stamps to the women inside. So that's a great, very practical suggestion. Thank you, Amy. Send Amy stamps or money for stamps. So we have to close now, but I really want to thank everyone for attending this initial webinar in our series on Living the Declaration. I hope that our speakers helped make Article 1 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, reaffirming women as female only, come to life for the women who were able to join us. Please join us again. Please encourage your friends to join us, and please encourage everyone to sign the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which you can find at womensdeclaration.com. Thank you so much, everyone.